a faith that can go down a water slide because we need a faith that can go down a water slide, in particular a Dominican Republic water slide. And I'm going to explain to you. I went to an island and they took me to a water park because that makes no sense. In the world's nicest beaches, they take me to go to a water park. The kind of water park where the river itself, the lazy river, literally didn't move. Yeah, crickets. It's a joke. But it literally didn't move. Like you had to run through the lazy river, and it just didn't make any sense to me. So they take me I was with some other gringos, and we went up to the top of the water slide, and we're like, okay, this is really great. You know the kind where you have lanes, and you jump on your back, and whee, and you go down, and you slide down, you splash in the bottom, and it's just playful fun. The problem is that in these water parks in the Dominican, they go down the slides like they drive. And their lines are also how they drive, which means everybody's just cutting through the lines and everybody's just racing to get to the top. And there are no rules, basically, right? So I'm used to here when it's like the guy, who gets paid way more than I do is at the top of the stairs going, your turn, your turn. And he's super sunburnt and just miserable, your turn. I hate children. He's just super miserable, but he gets paid more than I do. And so he's like, I'm used to that. But in the Dominican Republic, that wasn't there. So my gringo friend gets up there and he goes, all right, John, you just got to go. And he just jumps off and he launches off down the slide. And he's sliding down and it was really fun. And everybody's just like flipping. It's like Cirque du Soleil up there. People are just flipping and I'm waiting for my turn. And I can't time it right and I don't know what to do. Like, what are the rules to this thing? So I get ready and I'm like, every time I want to jump, some dude just whoosh, goes in front of me. He's like, okay. So I'm constantly doing this and I'm super hesitant. And so I finally jump. As I jump, I go, this is great, yay. And I get to the bottom and you get into like a little pool. And as I get up and I turn around, there's a giant Dominican man sliding right at me like this, like he's in a fighting game, like combo, like he's coming at me like that. And he's coming and I turn around, I have no time to move. He comes and just hits me right in the chest and I go poof, like in the Matrix, right in the water. And I go flying 30 feet back, and it was just absolute back to the lazy river that didn't take me anywhere. And so I had to get back up, and my friend's like, oh, don't worry, that was an accident. That doesn't ever happen before. And so next time he comes back, he's like, let's try it again. You're not going to get hit again. So I run back to the top of the thing, and this time I'm like, like, you wait, it's not going to. So my friend goes, whee, he jumps off, he's totally fine. He makes it 100% okay. I go again, this time looking, and I jump. This time, I'm now, as I'm sliding, spinning like this, so I can look behind me, right? And as I spin and I look behind me, there's a guy who jumped and he's going, ah, like this. And he's trying to like scoot on the slide like this to move out of the way, but he's not. And he's just like paddling his feet to get to me. And we know we're about to collide, right? Like you just know we're about to collide and this is really going to hurt. And so we get to the bottom and I'm trying to like get out of the way as I get up. Again, this time I'm hitting the back and I just get launched another 30 feet into the lazy river. And I remember the next time he's like, John, you want to do it again? I was like, I do not want to do it again. I do not want to jump without having everything planned out before I jump. I want to see, I want the order, I want it planned, I want no risk. I need this to be safe gringo style slides. Like I can't handle the risk. I'm not comfortable jumping off of things without guaranteed safety. But the problem is that we like to take prayer and look at it like that. We like to take the things of God and look at it like that, especially if we've jumped out in faith and been hurt before, or we missed it before, or Satan came and pile drived us on the slide down before. So the next time we get up there, we're like, I don't know about this, Jesus. Jesus, I don't know about this. Until we finally get too hesitant, where we get to the top of the stairs and says, once I'm convinced that it's safe, I can do it. Once I'm convinced I won't get hurt, Jesus, I'll take the step. Once I'm convinced that nothing's going to happen to me again, Jesus, I'll do it. The problem is that people equate their faith with being convinced of Jesus. Once I'm convinced of Jesus, then I can go. Once I'm convinced that this is what God wants me to do, then I'll go. But the truth is that Jesus wants us to have a faith that doesn't ask why. That's the kind of faith he wants. A faith that doesn't ask why, and a faith that doesn't have to be convinced before I jump. And it's one of the most challenging things for a Christian, to jump without the conviction or having all the things in a row that says this is going to work out and this is going to be okay. That's the kind of faith that Jesus is after. That's the kind of faith that doesn't have to ask why. Because the kind of faith that doesn't have to ask why can't be convinced otherwise. Like, think about that. If I didn't get into this because I was convinced it would work out, then I can't be convinced otherwise. I'm in it, whether, whether things start going positive or negative, I'm in this. I'm in this not because I know it's going to be fine, but because I didn't need it to all be all right before I jumped in. And it's a scary place of faith to be. And it's a hard thing for people to get to, the point of, I can't be convinced otherwise, right? But that's the kind of faith that we need to have and that God calls us to have. For example, I'll show you how this goes wrong, right? They're on the boat, the disciples, there's the storm, Jesus comes on the water. We like to talk about Paul. And when he jumps out the boat, we like to talk about Paul here. And Paul, for whatever reason, they see Jesus walking, they're like, it's a ghost. Okay, Peter, sorry, I'm saying Paul. Peter, thank you. They think it's a ghost. Like, that's really weird. I don't ever want an encounter with Jesus from it's a ghost, but they had one. And so they had the ghost, and he thinks it's a good idea, and he's convinced that I need to go out in the water to walk to him, even though he was on his way. You know what I mean? Did you ever think about that? Like, he was on his way, so why is he like, I should go out there? It's stormy. What do you ever think about? There's just waves. They thought he was a ghost a second ago, and he goes, I really should go out there. I'm convinced that this is a good idea. It makes no sense. Like, we preach about this and think, but if you actually stop for a second, he's coming to the boats, and the other guys were like, what are you doing? He's on his way. And he's like, no, this is going to be good. Brownie points in the heavens. Like, I'm going to get out there and watch. I'm going to meet Jesus out there, because that's the point. You ever were convinced of just something completely wrong, of like, oh, Jesus wants me to go out and do that really quick. And he's like, he's coming towards you, but we want to jump early sometimes, and we get in trouble. Okay, so he gets out on the boat, and he's like, Jesus, if you tell me to, I'll do it. And Jesus is like, okay. I'm coming, but no, okay. So he jumps out of the boat. He was convinced that he could do it. Why? Because he saw Jesus do it first. So he starts walking. He saw Jesus do it first, so he was convinced that it can happen. Just like for us, we need that conviction, right? Usually before we step out into faith into anything. So I can literally physically see Jesus doing it right in front of me. I go, okay, I'm convinced that if I get out in the water, it's going to be okay. So he can start walking out there. The problem is that your decisions in life and your decisions in faith are based on conviction first and being convinced that it'll work, is that you have to maintain your conviction the entire time. I have to keep convincing myself the entire time that this is the right thing, that it's going to work, that it's safe. And the pressure is on you to stay convinced. And the dangers with that is that you can get unconvinced, if that's the right word. Okay, let's go with it. You can get convinced otherwise. If I get into it and my faith is based on being convinced that this is the right thing, because all of my friends and all of my people told me that this is the right thing, and everything is based on my being convinced that this is the right move for me, then I have to maintain that convincing. And the danger, again, is I can be convinced otherwise. Because as he's walking out in the water, he was convinced a second ago is the best idea in the world, that Jesus did it so I can do it and I'll be safe. It says he started looking at the waves, he started looking at the storms, and he got convinced otherwise. And what happened? He started to sink. You see, if all of my decisions in life are based on being convinced that it's going to work out and it's going to be okay before I step out of the boat, then it's on me to maintain my conviction that it's going to work out. And then it's on me to fight off the doubts that this isn't going to work out. That's a lot of pressure. I've been there. That's a lot of pressure to step out saying, this is what God wants me to do. And I've been convinced. And maybe God, and this is what happens, maybe God put something in your heart, this idea, I need to study this. I need to do this in school. I need to go after this passion, this calling, this something in my life. I know there's this seed, right, that God puts in your heart. And the thing, instead of just going, okay, God, I see what it is, and I'm going to go right now without having to be convinced, we don't do that usually. That's the challenge, right? Most of the time we get it, and then we start convincing ourselves that it's correct, that it's a God thing, that I have the money for this. You ever wait to be convinced that you have the money for something? You ever wait to be convinced that, this is the right season in my life? You ever wait to be convinced that I have the right people around me to do this? You ever wait to be convinced and to be convinced and to be convinced? And the problem is, many times for a lot of us, is that we don't get convinced enough to even do it, and so we don't jump. We want to eliminate the risk factor of faith, but we'll never see the big miracles if we're just convincing ourselves, because we think with a human mindset when God doesn't. So we're convincing ourselves that in the natural and the human ways that this is going to work. And God's like, you can't even see the ways I'm going to make this work. But you're too busy trying to convince yourself. I've been there, man. And he gives you these ideas, and you wait, and you can wait. And sometimes you wait years and years to be convinced that it's what you're supposed to do in life. And people go to the grave never convinced enough that they were supposed to live a life for Jesus. And they miss out on the opportunity because they couldn't get convinced enough that that's what they were supposed to do. It is a dangerous area to have to be convinced in your faith and to have to convince myself in my faith. Because just like Peter, maybe I can even step out. If I could be convinced to get out of the boat, I could be convinced to sink because the pressure was on me. I'm the reason I got out first. And I'm the reason I'm going to sink. Because when those doubts come and those lies come, what happens? 3 months in, maybe a year in, maybe 2 years in, whatever God called you to do, you're convinced that this isn't it. And I get out of it. Marriages are broken up. Relationships are broken up because they convinced each other at the beginning that this is the one. This is God. Has to be the God. Why? Because they spent months and months and months, maybe years dating until they convinced themselves that this is the right one. Right? This has got to be the correct one. This has got to be it. I mean, look at this. And people go into relationships, maybe it's 6 months, and we convince ourselves, this is the perfect one. Right? This is it. This is the perfect one. This has got to be the perfect one. And so we get convinced. And then what happens? In month 7, something happens that convinces us otherwise. You know? And marriages are broken up because they were started with being convinced. We're super compatible. This is meant to happen. This is you and me. We're everything together. And this is not even just with relationships. This is with jobs. This is with careers. I go into a job. This job and I are super compatible. Look. And we start getting convinced every day. Look, it's so amazing. Look, it's so good. Look how much I love doing this. And we convince ourselves that this is it. I finally found it. But then in month 7 and month 8, things start to get a little different, right? And it starts to wear on you. And the things that they started to do are now coming out. And you start getting convinced the other way. And so what happens? I leave the job, I leave the relationship, I leave the commitment I made, I leave everything else because my life is not based on faith, my life is based on my convictions. And when it's based on my convictions, it's like you're the waves of the sea, right? It's constantly turning. It's constantly yes, constantly no, because it's based on my convictions, and those can change every day. It's a dangerous place to be. Jesus doesn't call us to live by being convinced or not. Faith is the thing that says, I know in my heart this is what I'm supposed to do, and I can't see all the answers now, and I don't know how it's all going to work out, and I get that there's risk, but I'm committed to it. If I can jump without being convinced first, then it's going to be difficult to convince me that I'm not supposed to do it. Because it's not based on, I know for a fact that this is God. I know for a fact that I'm supposed to do this. I know for a fact. If you had all the answers right away, we would never have any Bible stories. Like ever. Ever. None of the stories in the Bible. And you see a guy like David. David was convinced that he needed to kill Goliath. And the man didn't know. I mean, he's tiny. There's this giant guy. He was convinced, though, I have to kill Goliath. I know what I'm supposed to do. And he said, I thank God for the victory before he went out to fight. He knew this is going to happen. He didn't go, well, I have a sword and I have he didn't look at, even they tried to convince him otherwise, right? Saul brought the armor. He put it on him. He's like, this doesn't fit well. Maybe this is... He had all the opportunity to be convinced otherwise. But what happened? He's like, I'm going out there with a sling and stones, and I'm going to bring this dude down. Because he didn't get out on the battlefield in the first place because he needed convincing, because he had enough reasons to go. David had no reason to go except he knew God called him to do it. And he knew God was going to give victory. And he knew he was supposed to do it. That was enough to get him on the battlefield. And so when things like that happen, and discouraging things like that happen, the armor didn't fit, and they're like, maybe you shouldn't do this. When everything looked different, he gets out there anyways because he couldn't be convinced otherwise. Why? Because he didn't start by being convinced. We can't start by being convinced because if we do, man, we'll be convinced otherwise. And that's what happens. There's a lot of times that we make commitments to God, and we make these promises to God, and we get convinced after a good sermon, yeah, God, I'm convinced that I can do it, and God, I'm convinced. And then 2 months, 2 weeks, we get convinced otherwise. The decisions in life that we make, the callings in life that we go after, the things that we pursue, we need to do it because, like David, We knew at the start, this is what God called me to do, and I don't need the answers. It's a faith that doesn't ask why, and it's challenging. I'm not telling you today it's easy. I'm not telling you today like, yay, everything's sunshine. Like, God, I don't need to ask why. Why? Because asking God why is one of the most popular questions that we do. Who doesn't ask God why? Who doesn't ask, but God, what if we get out there and it doesn't work? God, what if we don't have the money? But God, what if we don't? You see how often we rely on these assurances before we even move, because we want the safety, not the faith. But God's after the faith. He's not concerned with your safety. Why? Because he's got it. You see what I mean? These are things that we worry about. These are things that we worry about, and that these are things that we have to maintain. I really feel like there's a lot of people here, and even a lot of people listening, that have been having to maintain for a long time. I'm having to maintain this conviction that God called me to do this, that I'm supposed to be in this place, I'm supposed to be in this school, I'm supposed to be in this job, I'm supposed to be in these things, and we convince ourselves daily, and there's been a battle over the mind and a battle over the heart about being convinced one way or the other. And we can get convinced even for the safety of the workplace, we can get convinced by the safety of the paycheck, we can get convinced by the safety of the insurance, and we get so convinced that we stay in one place when God puts in our heart the things that we were supposed to jump after. You know, I never want to be convinced of safety in my life. I don't ever want to make decisions just based on my conviction of it'll be comfortable. Because if I do that, boy, I'm going to miss out on what God's called me to do. I want the decisions in my life to be, I don't know why, I don't know how, but I'm going to have victory in this place. You know, I was talking to Clint earlier about this. He asked me, I worked in social work, right? And he asked me before I did, he's like, did you study? You know, what, do you have any background in this? And honestly, I'm a creative writing major. So I'm a creative writing major. I've never done social work at all. I've never studied. I've never done any of these sorts of things. And so God puts in my heart, he says, John, I want you to go into social work. I want you to get involved in your community. I was like, okay, cool. I started volunteering, right? Okay, God, cool, this is fine. And he says, ACH, I want you to go there. I want you to work with Texas's hardest kids that there are. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, God, that can happen. And I remember sitting there and making a promise to God saying, I'm going to do this, and I won't quit. I have no experience, I have no training, I have no schooling. I've got absolutely no reason why I should do this or succeed. But I said, I'm going to do this. And so I signed up right away. I went to the first training that was available, and I went into the hardest house that they had, not realizing it was the hardest house, but they put me in there. And I said, okay, let's do this. And all the other people around me, what did you study? Creative writing. You know, I like to write things. And they're like, what did you study? And they're like, I'm a psychology major. I'm working on, how deep therapy for children. I'm like, yes, that sounds helpful. Like, share some of that with me, because most people are like, why are you here? How did you even get here? And so I went in there, though, and I went into the house. And I remember the first day was absolute nightmare. I mean, it was craziness. I got in that house, and it was like a zoo with no walls. I mean, it was just things are flipping around and everything. And I remember shower time was just a nightmare, and there was screaming, and it sounded like an insane asylum. And I remember sitting there going, oh, my God. Like, what am I doing? Honestly, this is my first day, and I was like, what am I doing? Why am I here? This is totally wrong. Like, this is not going to work. And I had every opportunity to be discouraged and convinced the other way. Because then the next day, I had every opportunity to be convinced the other way. And every time a kid spit in my face, every time a kid bit me, every time a kid peed on me, every time a kid fought me, every time I had to do anything, every time that these awful things happen, I could be convinced the other way every single day. Every time your boss tells you something, every time, the people nag at you, every time those things that keep happening, those are every opportunity to be convinced the other way that you're supposed to not be there. And so I had every single opportunity, I tell you, to not want to be there. And I remember someone came and asked me, he said, John, I don't get it. Why can you smile after the kid just, smacked you in the face and spit in your face? Like, how can you smile the next time you see him? They literally asked me that, like, I don't get you. I don't get you. How can you do it? It's because inside I couldn't be convinced otherwise. because I wasn't convinced that I was supposed to be there, that I'm a social worker, that I was going to be the best social worker there was, that my future would be set in social work. I was not convinced at the start, so I couldn't be convinced otherwise. I was in there because, like David said, I'm going to have a victory here no matter what happens. That's the conviction that we need. That's the thing that we need, because God takes that and boy, does he bring success, and he brings victories, and he brings giants to get defeated in people's lives, and he can use you in a way that you've never seen possible. Why? Because you can't be convinced otherwise. God's looking for people who can't be convinced otherwise, that they have such grit that they can say, I can keep going and I don't care what happens because he said I'm going to have victory here, and that's why I'm walking in the first place. Not because I was convinced it was going to work. How many times in our life are we stepping into things of God without being convinced it's going to work? It's a challenge, right? It's a gut check. It's a gut check. Go home and pray about it. Cry about it if you need to. I do all the time. Like, how many decisions in my life, God, I make, and I want you to make it and bless it and make it safe. Right? That's common, right? That's common. I make decisions based on my conviction and my convincing, and I want Jesus to bless it. And he will, and he'll get involved. But he's after the faith that doesn't ask why. So maybe you're stuck in a situation. Maybe you're convinced. Maybe you're in a battle of being convinced today, whether right or wrong. Maybe you are going after what God's called you to do, but it's so convincing the other way. Every day it feels like, man, I can't make it. I can't do it. Maybe I'm in school and I can't. This is not going to happen. You know, maybe you need to do something. Maybe there's a new change. Maybe there's a commitment that God gave you and put in your heart that you need to step and go for it without having to be convinced. I honestly believe, and for people here and listening, that there are promises and that there are things in our hearts that God spoke to us a long time ago. And there are things and there is destinies in people's lives that have been sitting because we haven't been convinced enough to get out and to try. And I really feel the Holy Spirit bringing a pull and a push and that encouragement that says, get out now. Go for it. Don't be convinced. Make the jump without being convinced. Go for it and see what happens. Amen? Let's have the kind of faith that doesn't ask why. So I'm going to pray for you, and I'm going to just pray for that release. I'm going to pray for the release, and the release from the pressure of having to maintain it too. That's a hard place to be, to have to maintain, I'm at the right place. I'm in the right place. I'm in the right place. That's hard. I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing the right thing. Or convinced the otherwise, because there's people too that are being convinced that they're in the wrong place every single day, and they're struggling with it. You're in the wrong place. You're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to. You don't know what you're doing in life. You're wrong. You're messed up. You're not in the right thing. You can't do it right. You're being convinced. So many things being wrong. It's a hard place to be. It feels like you're drowning many times, and you're just being pushed by the waves. And Jesus is coming tonight to bring some freedom from having to be convinced. Instead, he wants to give you faith that says, man, step out, and I got this. Step out, and I'm going to take care of you. Step out, and he'll make a way.